Thank you for listening to the John Calvin podcast. For early access, bonus episodes, and a range of community benefits, sign up at johncalvinpod.com/support. That's johncalvinpod.com/support.
Whenever somebody asks me how I'm comfortable, leveling criticisms against Calvin, my usual response is I think he's able to handle it. I mean, there's that saying in tennis that the best way to show respect to your opponent is by continuing to play as hard as you possibly can. It's not respectful to let them win a game. That's the greatest sign of disrespect.
I'm super excited to have with us today Jon Balserak. He's currently visiting lecturer in history at the University of Illinois in Chicago. Jon was at the University of Bristol from 2008 to 2023. And before that, the University of Birmingham from 2002 to 2008. He received his PhD from the University of Edinburgh in 2002 and has been a fellow of the Royal Historical Society since 2016. And he's a really interesting Calvin scholar. And Jon, thank you so much for coming on the show.
It's my pleasure. I'm grateful for the invitation.
Would you mind maybe describing sort of how and why you developed an interest in Calvin originally?
Sure. It comes from my church background. I was going to a church, this is years ago, in the 1980s. And somebody at church happened to mention this book called Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. So I asked for it for Christmas and it blew me away. I'd never ever read anything like it and wanted to read more of the same. And that got me interested in the Puritans, which got me interested in Calvin. And I bought the Institutes. This would have been 1987. And to be honest, I never looked back. I found Calvin absolutely fascinating, and incredibly helpful. It was as if he knew what was on your mind, what struggles you were going through, that kind of thing. And so I just kept reading. And then once I ended up doing a PhD, of course, I couldn't choose any other topic but him.
What was it that originally that you found attractive about Calvin as you read him? What was it that particularly struck you in those early?
As I say, he's a writer who seems to know the human heart extraordinarily well, who knows the struggles that you go through, who knows how to address those struggles, but also, secondly, he's somebody who puts a lot of himself into his writing. I think you get a sense, more so than reading other writers. I could sit and name names, but I won't. Just with Calvin, you get a very clear sense of what this person is like. And I found that attractive. That's an appealing quality in a writer.
Yeah, that's interesting because it's often his... Martin Luther, the German reformer, who's often is sort of rolled out as being the one who wears his heart on his sleeve, and Calvin is often stereotyped as being quite dour and reserved.
I think most people who stereotype him that way, I don't mean to sound cliched, but I do think they must not have read very much of Calvin, because you're right, Luther and Calvin are very different. And consistently, when my students read Luther, they love him, and when they read Calvin, they dislike him intensely. But with both figures, they acknowledge this as a brilliant human being who's deeply interested in the subject he's telling you about and that kind of stuff. So,
one of the concepts you've sort of spoken about in your work is this idea in Calvin of divine accommodation, which I found a really helpful tool to sort of unlocking Calvin. Could you maybe explain that for people who might not be familiar with it?
So divine accommodation is an idea that has an ancient history. It goes back pre-Christian. You can find scholars using the notion from a Jewish perspective, from an Islamic perspective. Once Christianity comes in the scene, after Judaism, you get early church fathers using it in various ways. Ordinarily, the idea is to explain something that is prima facie confusing in Scripture. So this can be an idea like, how can an infinite, eternal God communicate to human beings? But you also get Augustine using the idea to explain why God in the Old Testament would require animal sacrifice and why he would forbid it in the New. So you get it entering into a discussion as a polemic device. So Augustine was able polemically to explain to those who criticize Christianity that their criticisms were wrong, and the mechanism he uses ends up being divine accommodation. Once you find Calvin using it, you do get all of what I just explained, but you also get a huge amount in his Old Testament commentaries, in particular, his commentaries on the law, the last 4 books of the Pentateuch, where you have all of this material that seems to justify slavery and so forth. Calvin comes in and argues that what explains all of that and makes sense out of it is divine accommodation, that God was accommodating himself to an Israelite community that was out of the ancient Near East, he says frequently, was barbaric. And so the law is given to a people that they can have some hope of achieving, rather than the perfect law that God would actually require or like to require of them. But the idea is eventually they'll come to a greater maturity and he can require more of them.
Yeah, it's an interesting concept. And how do you find students? I know you alluded to it earlier that sometimes people love Luther and they hate Calvin. But could you maybe say a bit more about that? Because that's something that I find interesting, what it must be like teaching Calvin in a secular context.
Sure. It's absolutely fantastic. My students, I couldn't imagine a more enjoyable group of people, but certainly they hate Calvin consistently. I mean, there are 1 or 2 who end up liking him, but I had one seminar where I introduced some reading from Calvin's Institutes, and to start off the seminar, I said, "So, what did you all think of the reading?" And I know her name, I won't say it on there, but this lovely, very bright young woman said, "Calvin is heartless, soulless, and inhuman." And I thought she was joking, so I kind of chuckled. She wasn't joking. She hated him with an intensity. So that sort of reaction is not one that I get every time I teach him, but it's a pretty consistent quality. They dislike him, but that same student 4 weeks later came up to me and said, "I still think he's insane, but he's a fantastic seminar read. He's engaging, he's brilliant, he's challenging." Yeah, and that's the pattern.
Interesting. Reminds me a bit of the description of Lord Byron: mad, bad, and dangerous to know.
Exactly. Yeah. But I do think he challenges them because he's obviously drop dead brilliant. And yet he'll come out with these things that they say, where in the world did that come from? And the fun thing is, they invariably have objections that they raise during the seminar. But of course, Calvin knew that 99 times out of 100, he knew they thought that. And so he has an answer. So you get to have either a fellow student or you, the seminar leader, say, "Well, you realize Calvin would say this in response." And so you get that fantastic experience of ultimately getting down to the principles that the 2 groups, Calvin and the seminar students, are taking for granted. That's what you whittle down to, and it's just fantastically enjoyable.
Yeah, I bet it's super interesting. And I can see as well why students would find him challenging, but also that his thought is stimulating to read. He's got a very sort of elegant style of writing that's very distinctive.
Absolutely, yeah.
I enjoyed your quote in your email signature. It gave me a chuckle where it says, "I continue to employ my usual severity while labouring to correct the prevailing vices, especially those of the young." Be interested to know how Calvin would engage with questions of students today.
Oh, yeah.
Could you maybe say a bit more about this upcoming book you've got going? Because that was what really piqued my interest. It's coming out soon, right? It's called Geneva's Use of Lies, Deceit and Subterfuge, 1536 to 1563, telling the old story in Reformation France. Could you maybe just say a little bit about what you're working on and what you're hoping to communicate?
Sure. So I'll go back to this middle of the 20th century. As recently as the 1970s, you can find journal articles on John Calvin that quote only the Institutes. And from roughly the 70s onwards, that changes. You get people like T.H.L. Parker looking at Calvin's commentaries, and other people, but I mean, Parker's a huge one. You get my former PhD supervisor, David Wright, doing the same thing, others. So by the 80s, 90s, people are looking at the commentaries. At the same time, the consistory records are being published by Bob Kingdon and his group. And so there's this opening up of vistas of Calvin's writing and thought that really people never really paid much attention to. And as we're beginning to pay more attention to these broader, wider, sometimes more unmanageable bits of Calvin's life and thought, new ideas are cropping up. Ideas that strike one as unusual at the beginning, but you can't, it seems to me, deny that they're part of his life. I mean, when you think about the fact that his writings, if you just put them in volumes right now between the Calviniopera and the Supplementa Calviniana, there's about 80 volumes, and the Institutes occupy 2 of those volumes. So it's unsurprising that we would be learning more about Calvin. Okay, so with that as a sort of a backdrop, let me say, a number of scholars have hinted at the idea that Calvin was willing to equivocate, sort of play fast and loose with bits of the truth when it served him to do so. And you can find, I mean, Bruce Gordon, Michael Walzer, you can find people doing that. I began reading along the lines of writing something on Calvin and was struck by a quote from an Italian scholar named Vittoria de Caprari, who basically said Calvin was willing to write letters back to people in France, encouraging them to form their own church congregations. And in doing that, he knowingly told others to violate duly constituted French law. And I still remember reading that quote and thinking, golly, that's right. I mean, Calvin. So I began probing how willing was Calvin to violate French law? In more broadly, how was Calvin grappling with the duties we owe to God versus the duties we owe to civil government, which is, of course, instituted by God? And as I probed that question, I began seeing more and more Calvin's willingness to effectively do almost whatever he thought needed in order to push the worship of God. I also, around the same time, was reading Heike Obermann, who has a discussion about Calvin turning French, which is, of course, humorous because he is French. But Obermann talks about the fact that Calvin develops an interest in the Reformation in France, the Huguenots, etc. And that, coupled with the work I was doing, I already mentioned, made me think, golly, how willing is Calvin in his interest to help the French Calvinist churches? How is he doing that? How is he willing to push the envelope, break laws, in order to see the church in France thrive. And as I began exploring that more and more, I began to realize he's doing so many different things to help the French Calvinist churches that there must be a plan behind them. It's not ad hoc. He's translating material into French and smuggling it, or having Laurent de Normandie and his team smuggle it into France. He's by 1555 or 1556, they're training and smuggling ministers into France. And I began to piece together, as I do in the book, all the different things that Calvin ends up doing to try to aid the French church. And it ends up, I think, part of what piqued my interest is when Charles IX becomes king in early 1561 or late 1560. He's 10 years old. So Catherine de' Medici is regent. And either she or he decides to send a letter to Geneva saying, "Why are you sending ministers into France? Please stop doing that." And also accusing the Genevans of sedition in relation to something which I'm happy to go into if you want me to, called the conspiracy of Amboise, but also a much lesser known conspiracy called the Meligny affair. So Geneva is all of a sudden confronted with these questions from the newly, installed king, or probably Catherine. And Calvin writes the response and completely lies on behalf of the Genevans, says, "We have never sent anybody into France." By that point, by 1560, they'd sent, estimates vary, but they had definitely been sending people in for at least 5 years. And on the sedition, he again says, we would totally oppose any interest in that kind of affair. Calvin and Beza had actually involved themselves in a seditious affair from September of 1560. So it was just had happened. And the fact that Calvin, the letter's been translated into English, you can read it in the collected, letters. The fact that Calvin was so willing to produce a sort of a bald-faced collection of lies made me think, okay, this really does seem like he's had a plan all along that's been developing and operating. He's now been caught out. And so the lie that he tells in this letter on behalf of the Genevan Council can't have just been an ad hoc thing. It can't. I came to the conclusion that this must have been more of a developed plan to aid the French Reformed churches, and my book tries to outline that plan. I'm hugely conscious that there are questions that arise out of me saying that Calvin lied. I'm happy to talk about that. But that's the gist of it.
Yeah, the implications if Calvin lied would be a really interesting one to get into in a little bit. But just to maybe just come back to what you see as being Calvin's motive in doing that. Is it that he's wanting to, why do you think, what's his motive for behaving the way he does, do you think?
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer with any certainty. I try to address it in the final chapter of the book, but I can say in the general way, it makes sense, of course, that he wants to assist the French churches in any way possible, right? That's not surprising. It also makes sense that Calvin thinks Roman Catholicism is idolatry. He thinks that the French kings have, since Francis I onwards, have been essentially demanding that the French people engage in idolatry. And so there's a question that I think is a difficult one to give a definitive answer to, but there's a question as to whether Calvin thinks um, things are just so desperate that, and the king pushing idolatry the way that he has for a long time is no longer legitimately king, and therefore one might suggest that it's okay to lie to him, or that we're in a kind of a state of war where lies are not, like most theologians at that point all the way through the Middle Ages argued during war, it's not sinfully lying to, for example, hide your motive, hide your actions, etc. You shouldn't, I mean, Aquinas says you shouldn't tell a bald-faced lie, but it's okay to hide what you're doing. This is wartime, etc., etc. Anyway, so I think his motivation is he wants to help the French people to establish the Christian church over against and in place of the Roman Catholic Church. That's the motive. And that he's willing to disobey he's willing to disobey the king. I had one friend who argued that isn't Acts chapter 5 all we really need to go on, where Peter says, we must obey God, not men. Isn't that really all that's happening here? And I disagree with my friend, because Peter and the apostles didn't engage in lying. They simply disobeyed the civil government. Calvin's disobeying the civil government of France, but he's also engaging in dissembling and craftiness and lying and so forth and so on.
Interesting. And so how do you think, I think you alluded to it earlier, how do you think that impacts how people see Calvin? Because obviously he's quite he's a fascinating figure to study, and because of the layers of interpretation that have been put on him. There's all sorts of people who absolutely hate Calvin, as we've alluded to. There's others who see him as like the best thing since sliced bread, and everything in between. But yeah, how do you sort of square that with Calvin? Did it make you dislike him more?
No. Yeah, it's a really good question. So no, I mean, the one aspect of this research that I haven't addressed yet is that there's a decent amount of scholarship on the fact that during the early modern period throughout Europe, particularly Italy and France, but really throughout Europe, lying, dissembling, the kind of craftiness that's associated with the life of somebody in a court of a king or a queen, all of that is supercharged during the early modern period. I mean, there's scholarship that argues by John Snyder, by a group of people from Italy whose name I don't remember, that argues that dissembling was commonplace and was accepted. It was just a part of life in the early modern period, to a degree that is not true of the 21st century. We are much more alert and aware if somebody fibs, if somebody twists the truth, than they would have been. And that, so you asked me whether it makes me dislike Calvin or something. I don't know exactly whether Calvin is just a man of his times, and that's all we need to say in order to explain what's happening, or whether there's some deeper motivation. But whatever the case, I certainly think Calvin is not some renegade, Machiavellian who has no interest in the truth. He's not sort of cartoonishly evil or something. I think he is intensely interested in making France Protestant or, evangelical. And that interest overwhelms him. I mean, I just think to the degree that he gets caught up in what he's doing, he may well have kind of lost track of the fact that he's verging from the truth on. So when he flees France in after the whole affair with Nicholas Kopp, supposedly Calvin helped draft or even drafted the rectorial address that Calp gives in 1533. After he flees France, very quickly, he adopts a pseudonym. Now, pseudonyms were not uncommon, but Calvin effectively uses pseudonyms for the rest of his life. And it's just part and parcel of him adopting a persona that seems perhaps to not be as concerned with accuracy and truthfulness as you and I sitting in the 21st century might want him to be. But it certainly doesn't make me think he's ungodly or dislike him. I adore him. I tell my students all the time, my life would be very different if John Calvin were not a part of it. And they think I'm joking, and I know I'm actually being serious.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? I'll look forward to reading your book. It already sounds so interesting. The war mentality that you spoke of, I could imagine why that might have shaped how people in those days and maybe Calvin approached these issues, because, yeah, like just reading into, like just how brutal it was in those days. Like, it's easy for us to lose sight of that. So this is a time where the religious beliefs were life and death issues in many ways. So under Francis I, I was reading an account of one of the evangelicals they used to cut their tongue out and then burn them at the stake, but they'd cut their tongue out to stop them, spreading their poison, as it were, being a martyr. And you just think, wow, it's just so different. It's a different universe, and particularly the sheer brutality and how terrifying that must have been.
I think that's absolutely. I mean, I think we, to some degree, have the luxury of insisting on precision and truthfulness. Like you say, our tongues are not going to be cut out for saying the wrong thing, or Yeah, I think you're right.
Where do you hope to see Calvin's studies going in the future?
Well, I think the trajectory it's on is a good one. I plot this in an early chapter of the book. There's a long history that's already been addressed by Irina Bacchus and Richard Muller and William Bousma and others, Heike Obermann, of Calvin studies essentially today, well, more like in the middle of the 20th century, being representing the pro-Calvin side of a dispute that had been going on between pro-Calvin and anti-Calvin figures for hundreds of years. Then you get Bousma, Irina Bacchus, Heike Obermann, and Richard Muller arguing that is a problem. That's not a good thing. Obermann says the worst thing that could have possibly happened to Calvin. He fell into the hands of his friend. And with that, you get in the late 20th century, a push towards a more historical assessment of Calvin that isn't afraid to criticize, at the same time isn't afraid to compliment. I mean, both sides are legitimate because he's a complex figure. And as I already spelled out, that is happening at the same time as this much broader analysis of his writings is pursued. The one thing that I hope my book tries to do that is a little bit novel is consider Calvin's actions as well as his writing. And I did that primarily, of course, by looking at his correspondences, which they're voluminous. He wrote as everybody did, wrote constantly. And when you look at the correspondences, you get this figure who is a complex figure. So you're asking where I hope things go. I hope they continue down that path. I mean, whenever somebody asks me how I'm comfortable, leveling criticisms against Calvin, my usual response is I think he's able to handle it. I mean, there's that saying in tennis that the best way to show respect to your opponent is by continuing to play as hard as you possibly can. It's not respectful to let them win a game. That's the greatest sign of disrespect. So in the same way, I respect Calvin. I think he can handle criticism. And I would love to see more and more exploration of this analysis of Calvin as a man of his time, a figure who's incredibly complicated the way lots of figures who we still talk about today are, and complicated is okay.
And how do you think Calvin, because you alluded to this earlier where you were saying you felt like Calvin had a good grasp on human nature, I think was it you said, a good grasp on human beings. Could you maybe say a bit more about that? Like what?
I mean, I think that's one thing. I mean, you see it in the Institutes. You do. I think his chapter on faith, book 3, chapter 2, is astounding in its analysis of the way believers doubt, how doubts are obviously talked about in scripture. David doubts, and how they're addressed, what's behind them, what's going on. But I think you see that even more in the sermons and the commentaries. You see Calvin talking about issues related to the doubt a person has over whether God's going to answer their prayers. And he talks about how he knows it's incredibly difficult to pray when you've been waiting for months for an answer and it hasn't come. But then he's able to he has this, as I'm sure you know, this amazing ability to return to the passage he's commenting on and just sort of reapply the truth and make you see that you can't, just because it's hard, give up on the truth and say it doesn't apply here. God has given promises. We should go to God in prayer constantly with the belief that he will answer them because he's promised to do so. And so in that way, he's able to take the reader of his sermons or his commentaries, run them through a struggle that he himself surely has been through, and a struggle that any Christian reader, him or herself, is also going through, and just walk you through how to address it and bring you out at the other end where he thinks scripture wants you to be. I mean, if you know Psalm 13, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? That psalm ends with the psalmist talking confidently about God, responding. And Calvin, that's a wonderful example of him acknowledging the real cry of a soul that is in anguish and feeling like God has forgotten them, and bringing them to the utter conviction that God's word is truthful and that I'm going to continue to believe in, even though I haven't got a reply yet. So I think time and time again, he's able to do that. And he shows that he's able to do it because he's been through it himself. I think he talks with such awareness of what it's like to struggle.
Yeah, like when he loses his wife and his son.
Absolutely. And it's right around that time, of course, that he and Bullinger are working on the Consensus to Greenness. So you're dead right. In the letters, you get this grief. He talks about busying himself just so he doesn't have to think about it. Yeah, I mean, it's a person that all of us know and that all of us have experienced. You're dead right.
Are there any particular aspects of Calvin that you would maybe, I mean, we've alluded to some of it a bit more, but in his approach that you are unsure about or that you would disagree with?
I think he to take the issue of the civil magistrate, he clearly assumes things about the role of the civil magistrate, about the significance of the civil magistrate to a commonwealth that I think the majority of Christians, certainly the majority of Calvinists today, would say is just a non-starter. I mean, he wants to see the church, the head of the church the church and the state effectively as two eyes that direct the body politic towards pleasing God, and that they both have different roles, but they both have an aim. So, right, I mean, I hesitate intensely to use modern terminology to explain what Calvin held, because I think all the people in, like, the Christian nationalists today who try to harken back to Calvin, I think they're wrong. But he clearly had a view of the civil magistrate that I can't possibly agree with today. And of course, he also didn't really believe in freedom of speech. There's some excellent work done by John Whitty, arguing that he and the Reformed tradition generally sets down the basics that do become a position of freedom of speech. But he himself didn't adhere to it. And of course, you could get in big trouble in Geneva if you said the wrong thing, as lots of people did. So that would be another where just thinking about the nature of life, the Christian life, I'm a big believer in freedom of speech. I think it's essential to moving forward. That was not the way it was in Geneva. Not at all.
Yes, like I was reading an account in Bruce Gordon's biography of, you know, boys skipping catechism classes and being like beaten with sticks as a punishment, for example. And there's moments like that where you kind of just go, wow, you're just sort of entering a different universe in assessing this. But some of the consistory records are fascinating. I've just begun to glance at some of them to think, what must it have been like to know that you could get, you know, called up for dancing, for example. Like, Calvin's not a fan of dancing.
Yeah. Well, and they tried to, first he tried to close any pubs in Geneva. He got such pushback that they opened the pubs, but they put religious literature on the tables with the idea that should be what you spend your time doing. And of course, that didn't go over very well either. So yeah, I mean,
I'd quite like that, being able to sit around and talk about, I don't know, theology. I'm slightly biased, but that sounds quite fun.
Oh no, personally, I think it sounds great. I think, you know, refusing to let people talk about a football match they watched last night would be a little bit different, but no. I mean, you can see where he's going, and I do think, I mean, all the sort of talk of Calvin being, in effect, convinced that he is speaking for God, and that if you disagree with him, you disagree with God. I know that is something that ends up being said by haters of Calvin, and I am not one of those people. But I think on that point, they're correct. I think pretty much Calvin was convinced he was a prophet of God, and if you disagreed with him, it wasn't a matter where you and he were on the same plane. It was a matter where you were disagreeing with the spokesperson of God, and that was, you know. So, but yeah, I would like the option of talking theology in a pub. Absolutely.
Jon, thanks so much for coming on to the show. And if you want to read any of Jon's books, there's a number that you can get. He's got a very short introduction series published by Oxford University Press, a very short introduction to Calvinism. There's also a longer biography of Calvin, John Calvin, a 16th century prophet, which are all worth checking out. And thank you so much, Jon, for coming on. It's been really, really interesting, and I will read your new book with great, great interest. It sounds so interesting, and yeah, appreciate your time.
Absolutely. If you want to talk again, I'd love to do it.
I'd love that too.
Lovely to chat.
Thank you for listening to the Jon Calvin podcast. For early access, bonus episodes, and a range of community benefits, sign up at joncalvinpod.com/support. That's joncalvinpod.com/support.